Naval power is often discussed in terms of platforms. How many ships a fleet has, how advanced they are, how far their sensors reach, or what they can carry. That's not ultimately where modern naval power is decided. It's decided in that space between damage and recovery. For about 80 years, Western navies have lived in a historically unusual condition. Since the end of World War II, there has not been a prolonged period where major fleets suffered sustained losses faster than they could be repaired or replaced. Yes, there have been accidents, fires, collisions, a terror attack, isolated combat incidents. In rare cases, ships have been lost, but nothing that forced the system as a whole to demonstrate whether it could regenerate combat power under sustained pressure. And that really came forward in the comments on the last video about the USS Connecticut, and I think this deserves attention. It's that absence period since the Second World War that's kind of shaped everything that's followed and led us to where we are today. Over time, naval forces were optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Fleet sizes shrank. Individual platforms became exponentially more complex, certainly more capable, and absolutely far more expensive. Shipyards consolidated, production lines started to narrow. The underlying assumption was that serious damage would be manageable, outright losses would be the exception, and that long repair timelines could be tolerated without strategic consequence. That assumption has become embedded in the industrial base itself. And if you watch the previous episode on the USS Connecticut or know the story, and you have that in mind, the details about the incident for this discussion matter less than what it reveals about the system. The Connecticut didn't create this problem, but it exposed it. This was not a combat loss. There was no enemy action and no uncertainty about what happened. I will grant you we don't know the full details, so perhaps there is some uncertainty there, but I think you get the point. And yet, a single navigation accident removed a highly capable nuclear-powered submarine from operational service for years. Not because the Navy lacked urgency, and not because the technology was beyond repair, but because fixing a modern submarine inside a tightly constrained industrial system is slow by design. Once a nuclear-powered boat is damaged, everything becomes sequential. It has to wait for dry dock space. It has to compete with scheduled maintenance, carrier overhauls, new construction, and deferred work that has already accumulated. Then when the hull is open, new problems are often discovered, right? You probably own a car. You get that principle. Basically, in that principle is adding this unplanned work that displaces other projects or brings the cost, brings the timeline up. None of this is abnormal. It's how the system normally operates, just here with very little slack. The Seawolf class makes this especially clear. Only 3 of the boats were ever built, and once production ended, each hull became effectively irreplaceable. There's no production line, there's no restart, there's nothing sitting idle, there's no reserve workforce trained specifically for that class. Any major repair ties up people in facilities that are also needed elsewhere, and often for higher priority programs, like the Columbias, the ballistic missile submarines. This is where the distinction between repair, replacement, and loss really matters. Repair consumes capacity immediately. Replacement consumes time. Loss consumes both. In practice, repair often delays replacement because the same shipyards, workers, and suppliers are all involved in all 3 outcomes. A badly damaged ship that remains technically repairable can occupy critical resources for years, even if building a new hull would ultimately take longer. The system favors repair because replacement timelines are even more daunting, and because accepting loss carries long-term consequences that are difficult to reverse. Those timelines aren't long because of indecision, but because modern shipbuilding, like we described, is rigid. Dry docks are fixed assets. Yard specialization limits flexibility. right? Nuclear qualified trades take years to train and certify. Many components have only one or two qualified suppliers, with lead times measured in years rather than months. So even when funding is available, there's no mechanism to instantly snap our fingers and expand the throughput. Even money can't buy priority in a queue, and it can't buy time. That was never really built into this system. And this is not a uniquely American problem. There was a great comment to the effect that across Western navies, the pattern's similar. Extremely capable ships, but very small fleets, and industrial bases sized for steady state operations. So in many countries, the yards that built earlier generations of warships can no longer exist at scale. Losing even a small number of hulls or sidelining them for extended repair has immediate effects on coverage, deployment schedules, and training cycles. At the same time, the global environment has shifted towards scale and persistence. China now accounts for, roughly half of global shipbuilding capacity? And in that case, the capacity is closely integrated with naval construction. The key distinction is not quality versus quantity, it's the ability to absorb damage, accept loss when necessary, and keep producing. In a prolonged conflict, regeneration matters more than perfection. And that leads to a question that's rarely discussed clearly. What actually happens after the first serious damage? I'm not even talking about necessarily like a sinking, God forbid, but a handful of ships removed from service long enough to matter. The answer isn't collapse, but it's cumulative long-term strain. One loss or a long-term repair is absorbable. 2 creates scheduling pressure. 3 or 4, now that's going to begin to distort deployment cycles, compress training, overall reduce flexibility, right? That's at like the macro level. Commanders may quietly accept more risk. Maintenance gets deferred. Crews rotate through platforms. They're no longer aligned with the planned readiness timelines. The fleet remains operational, but increasingly more brittle. The uncomfortable part is that none of this is especially visible. I spent this week reading through like GAO reports and testimony. Like, it's dense, it's not exciting, it's not accessible. I mean, to a degree it is, but the point is there's no dramatic announcements. The effects show up quietly in those spaces. Also, the effects show up quietly in how often ships deploy, how long they're able to deploy for, how long they stay out, how thinly, at times, forces are spread across regions. That's the big picture. But what actually helps? And this is something to think about. There's no single program. There's no quick fix. What matters is industrial depth, more dry dock capacity, more trained trades, longer production runs that preserve skills instead of relearning them, inventory buffers for critical components. And with that, of course, is a willingness to pay for that capacity. And it's sometimes capacity that sits idle for most of the time, because that idle capacity is what can absorb the shocks. Those investments, they're politically difficult, no matter what party, what country, where your politics are. It's difficult for anyone precisely because it looks inefficient in peacetime. This stuff doesn't produce dramatic visuals or immediate results, but it is what determines whether a fleet can or cannot recover when things go wrong. Naval power today is not just about ships in the water, it's about the systems behind them and how much stress those systems can absorb before overall it begins to deform. Western navies remain extremely capable on day one of a conflict, but what's far less certain is how well they recover or replace what's lost by day 7, by day 30, by day 90. You get the point there, and it's one that we have to talk about because wars aren't won by the platforms that we start with. They're won by the systems that can survive the friction, absorb loss, and keep going. If you've worked in shipbuilding and fleet maintenance, generally in the Navy, in any time of planning or operational capacity, I'm very interested in your perspective and how this looks from where you sit. The gaps, the trade-offs, they often show up first in places that the public, myself included, rarely see. So I'm interested. We'll go over now just to the comments section, and we've had a lot of great discussion this week, and so I definitely am looking for your input there as well, and just to see like what am I missing here? Like what haven't we looked at? What do we have to account for? And so I do read all the comments, and certainly I will look for you there. I appreciate a couple of minutes, and I hope you have a great new year. We will talk very soon.